Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Griffith, and the talk I'm giving today is called Correspondence, Truth, and Social Reality. The aim of the paper is to begin a defense of the view that social truth consists in correspondence to social reality, so that truth in the domain of social truth is a kind of correspondence. And to do that, I began to develop an account of the social construction of truthmakers that are the correspondents of social truth. I want to begin with a quote from Hegel's Science of Logic. This is something I think that Hegel gets just right about truth, regardless of how it ends up being used in his own system. But he says this: truth is the agreement of thought with the subject matter, and in order to produce this agreement, for it's not there on its own account, thought is expected to be subservient and responsive to the subject matter. So I've highlighted subservient and responsive to, and I think we'll see how that gets played out in this as we go. But let me begin by saying something about social truths. I take social truths to be a diverse class of truths that include truths about our social identity. So Jack is genderqueer. Jones is black, for example. It also includes institutional truths. So Northam is the governor of Virginia. It includes legal truths, such as it is illegal to have a couch on your porch in Boulder, Colorado. And then also social structural truths, something like black women face unique forms of oppression. I think so as you can see, social truths do constitute a kind of broad class of truths, but are unified by the fact that they are all talking about the social world and the different features of the social world. Now, I want to turn to an objection that is relatively common in the literature on truth that entails that there's a problem with applying correspondence theory to social truths. So you find this in the work of Linda Alcoff, Michael Lynch, and Douglas Edwards, the thought that according to correspondence theory, the correspondents have to be mind independent, right? And so I think you can already see where the problem is going to lie. And so these thinkers can be read as giving an argument along these lines. So premise one says, the correspondence theory of truth demands that the objects of correspondence be mind independent. Right? That's just a claim about the correspondence theory of truth. Premise two, social reality is constituted by mind-dependent entities. Therefore, it follows no object in social reality can be the correspondent of a truth. Therefore, no claim can correspond to social reality. And therefore, finally, the correspondence theory of truth does not apply to claims about social reality. Now, in this talk, I'm really going to push on premise one, but I'm also going to discuss premise two, which I think needs to be understood in a certain way. So let me focus on Michael Lynch's version of this objection. So in his book, 2009 book, Truth is One in Many, he raises what he calls the scope problem for substantive theories of truth. And this is the idea that theories of truth like correspondence, coherence, pragmatism, each look plausible in some domains, but implausible in other domains. And so he thinks that correspondence looks just right when we're talking about middle-sized dry goods, physical objects in our environment. And the way that he construes correspondence is in terms of a causal notion. And he says that it's this idea that a belief that A is F is true if and only if the object denoted by A has the property denoted by is F. And according to Lynch, this causal correspondence is committed to saying that true beliefs map objects that exist and have their properties mind independently. Where what he means by that is that an object exists or has a property mind independently at some time just when it would continue to exist or have that property, even if there were no mind that represented as having that property. Another condition or another thing that he says that correspondence theory is committed to is that the objects and the properties that are mapped onto are capable of entering into at least indirect causal interaction with our minds. So that's the version of correspondence theory he's concerned with, and concerned to argue that it faces this scope problem. But my response is to say that even if that's the correct correspondence theory, framed in terms of causation, and even if it faces scope problems in domains like mathematics or ethics, I'm not convinced that it extends to the social domain. Because many thinkers in social ontology have noted that institutions, genders, races, social structures are real and in fact causally efficacious. They're there in the world to be referred to and interacted with. So even if there is a scope problem, the causal nature of correspondence doesn't seem to pose a problem itself for application to the social world. The second thing I want to say in response to Lynch is that that social reality is mind-dependent, but that doesn't mean that we can't be responsive to it, because social reality is by and large independent of any token belief that an individual might have of it. So even if facts about genders and races and institutions are dependent upon collective acceptance, it doesn't follow that they're dependent upon any individual belief about those things. And I think another thing to note is that Lynch is tying this criticism to a specific causal version of correspondence, yet there are also non-causal versions of the correspondence theory that don't seem to face the problems that he's raising, that don't seem to run into problems because of this requirement that there be some causal relation between the belief and then the thing being referred to or talked about. Okay, so that's my response to Lynch. Let me move on to Douglas Edwards' recent attempt to argue that the correspondence theory doesn't apply in the case of social truths. I should note that both Edwards and Lynch are alethic pluralists, so they think that truth is a plural thing. It can be manifested in different ways in different domains of discourse. Edwards argues that some predicates, he says, are responsive, whereas others are generative. So he thinks of scientific predicates like is magnetic as responsive to a world beyond the predicate and our beliefs, right, to a mind-independent world. So it's there. The properties are there to be, to be talked about, and so the predicate and our use of the predicate in making true claims is responsive to that world. But Edwards conceives of institutional and social predicates like is a woman as generative in some way, that you actually get a dependence of being on truth, on his view. So that our use of the predicate is a woman or is black or is white actually helps generate the social world. And so he says that notions like magnetic and other scientific predicates have a wide cosmological role, which just means that they play a role in explaining things that can't be explained by our beliefs alone. But institutional and social predicates have a narrow cosmological role, so they figure in explaining things that can be explained just in terms of our beliefs. And so on his view, social predicates and social beliefs actually generate the social world. So he claims that being, in the social case, depends on truth. And just to fill out Edwards' picture, he says correspondence is not truth in the social domain, yet he thinks superwarrant is truth in the social domain, where superwarrant is a kind of durable warrant over the course of inquiry. All right, moving on to my response to Edwards. So even if social predicates are generative, it doesn't follow that they aren't there to be referred to. By that, I mean the properties that they generate aren't there to be referred to. Because again, making the point that I made about Lynch, token beliefs can be responsive to social reality because social reality, by and large, does not depend upon token beliefs. So I think it's quite implausible to think that any particular person's use of a social predicate somehow generates the social world. I think what you need is something far more expansive: collective acceptance, widespread practices, even material infrastructure is going to do more to construct the social world than just any individual belief. But I also think that Edwards has misunderstood the way in which social ontologists have thought about the construction of the social world, because I don't think that anybody thinks that the social world is dependent upon the truth of our claims. So being doesn't depend on truth with respect to social reality. Rather, it depends on our beliefs, our attitudes, actions, patterns of interactions, material structures. So it's not truth that's playing any role in constructing social reality. Rather, it's the taking to be true. And I think that a number of folks have recognized that even widespread false belief can produce social constructions like race, for example. So there's my response to both Lynch and Edwards. I think that their critiques of the correspondence theory of truth just kind of fall flat when it turns to social reality. That social reality can be there for us to refer to, for us to be responsive to in our beliefs, even though that reality is socially constructed. Okay, let me move on now to say a bit more about correspondence and how I think it is applicable to the social world. So let's begin with a very generic statement of the correspondence theory of truth. So on C, P is true if and only if P corresponds to the way that things are. Now, C doesn't specify what correspondence is or what sort of entities constitute the way things are. So it's really coarse-grained at this point. It needs to be precisified in quite a few ways. But the thing that I like about it at this point is its generality. It permits those correspondents to be mind-dependent entities, or even linguistic or representational entities. Because sometimes we do say true things about language or representation. But let me move on to fill out C in a particular way. So here I want to draw on the work of Joshua Rasmussen, who defends a kind of correspondence theory that runs like this. He says a proposition P corresponds to an arrangement A, and by arrangement he means something like a state of affairs in the world, if and only if, one, for each exemplifiable part of P, there is a part of A that exemplifies it. On Rasmussen's view, propositions are structured things, and they're composed of things that can be exemplified. And so the idea is that the parts of the proposition can be exemplified by things in the world. Okay, condition 2, the proposition that A exists entails P, and 3, every part of A is part of a composition that overlaps exactly those things that exemplify part of P. So one nice thing about R is that it allows the correspondent to be mind-dependent. It doesn't require that the correspondence of truths be mind-independent. And the next nice thing about R is that it doesn't obviously face the scope problem that Lynch was raising for the correspondence theory of truth, because Lynch was thinking there's got to be this causal connection between our beliefs and the correspondent. And so that's going to rule out all these cases of mathematics and ethics and possibly legal truths and other social truths. But R is not explained in terms of causal connections. It's explained in terms of exemplification. And so the nice upshot for us is that R seems to apply to social truths as long as social properties are instantiated in the world or exemplified in the world. All right, let me just pause to say something about the connection between correspondence and truth-making. I think of these as kind of kindred views that are related to each other in a certain way. They're not identical because the correspondence theory of truth is a theory of truth. It's telling us what truth is or what truth consists in. And I think of correspondence as taking us in one direction from truth to reality, saying for something to be true is for the world to be a certain way. So we go kind of, down. We go from truth to reality. Truth-making, on the other hand, works in the opposite direction. It gives us an account of how truths depend upon reality, how truths depend upon or are grounded in reality. And so they're kind of, flip sides of each other. They're two sides of the same coin, on my view, which, if correct, would back a kind of principle C to T. If P is a proposition and corresponds to X, where X is a fact, then X makes P true, right? So simply, the correspondent is the truth maker for the proposition. So next, I want to say something about socially constructed truth makers or socially constructed correspondents of truth. I think the social world is composed of things that have been socially constructed. I think of social construction as the determination by social factors of something, a kind, an object, an institution, something like that. Where I think of determination, at least in some cases, as a kind of metaphysical grounding, where that's a directed, non-causal dependence relation of giving rise to that can't be analyzed in purely modal terms. And just to put up my cards on the table, I'm also a grounding pluralist, which means that I think that grounding can take a variety of forms. In fact, I think that different dependence relations can play the grounding role in different cases. So just to be clear, I don't want to say that all social construction is grounding, because I do think that there's causal social construction. And even though I think that there are many cases of grounding being social construction, that grounding might take different forms in different cases. Okay. But I want to focus here just, I'm going to give an example in just a moment. But I want to focus on a certain kind of construction that I'm calling humankind construction. So HKC says S is non-causally socially constructed as a K, where that's like a social identity, like one's race, one's disability status, one's gender, one's class, for example. Only if the fact that S is a K is at least partly metaphysically grounded in a particular network of social relations in which S is involved. Okay, so to bring this out with an example, so take the proposition that S is black. So we have some subject S who is black, right? This is what the proposition is saying. So we've got a social truth, and down here we have a social fact, which I'm taking to be a state of affairs, something that obtains in the social world. And I'm not going to say much about the construction of this fact other than what I just said with HKC. I take it that there's lots of ways to articulate how such a fact might be constructed. But the crucial part for our purposes is just that we do have a social fact that can be the correspondent or the truth maker of the claim here. And I want to show how Rasmussen's view might work out in this case. So the proposition S is black has different components, and those different components, S and is black, are exemplified by something in the social world, right? So you have the fact that S is black is exemplifying the parts of the proposition, and it does so in the right order. So we've got condition 1 met, that the parts of the proposition are exemplified by parts of the fact, and 2, you have the condition met, condition 2 is met, that the fact that S is black exists. That entails that S is black. Right? And then 3, the fact that S is black is the smallest arrangement that meets conditions 1 and 2. And then by my principle connecting correspondence and truth making, you get the fact that S is black being the truth maker for the proposition that S is black. So there's a toy example. A lot more needs to be said about it just because we want to know more about the construction of the fact. But I think once we do have the fact and that obtaining, we can give this account of correspondence. So social truth looks like it can correspond to social reality on this view. So I just want to conclude by saying that the mind dependence of social reality really poses no problem for the application of the correspondence theory of truth to social reality. And there's a lot more to say about both truth and about social reality. And I'm hoping to do that in some future work, but wanted to work out a response to the objections that I'm seeing in the literature at this point. All right, thank you very much.